Shalom, this is Dan. You know, a few days back we had some weather here in Tennessee, and a couple towns over had tornadoes and such. But I got to thinking today as I was reading over the Torah portion, you know, the Israelites, they had some weather patterns that were a little awkward, maybe a little scary at times, just like the tornado was. You know, when we read the Torah portion this time, we find that the Israelites had this fire by night and this cloud by day that guided them. And their weather pattern was, well, they were kind of storm chasers of their time. You know, they weren't chasing tornadoes and such, but they were still being guided by the cloud and by the fire. As I was thinking about this portion, my thoughts went to the fact of having such a visual illustration of God's leading. You know, they knew where God was directing them because of this fire and cloud, but they also knew when to move because of this fire and cloud. When the fire stayed still or the cloud stayed still, they stayed still. When the fire or cloud moved, they would move. And it got me to wondering, I want this same visibility, this same guiding, so to say. I want to know that the steps that I take are the steps that God has told me to take. And not only that, but that the steps that I'm walking in direction of are the directions that God wants me to walk in. That's one of the biggest challenges I take out of this Torah portion. But it's not the only challenge. You know, let's talk about fear for a little bit. The Israelites, they were standing on the bank of the Red Sea. Now, I'm sitting here at one of the lakes here over by my house, and I love coming out here because it's just woodsy and calm and peaceful. But to imagine myself walking on dry land across this lake, I can't imagine that. And here are the Israelites, and they're standing on the bank of the river, the bank of the sea, and they have Pharaoh's army coming on them. Well, that same weather pattern, that same fire that was leading them by night, it came and it separated them from Pharaoh. But here's the great thing. If you read Exodus, my verse here for you. If you read Exodus 14:4, I love the words that Moses gave the people of Israel because they were freaking out. And here's what he said: Adonai will do battle for you. Just calm yourselves down. Adonai will do battle for you. Just calm yourselves down. How many times would it benefit us to hear those same words and apply them to our own selves? Calm down. God is fighting for you. I live in a time sometimes where I get fearful about the little things or even fearful about the big things. But all the while, God is not doing anything more than saying, calm down. I got this. I got it all under control. We see that the same army that came from Egypt and it was chasing after the Israelites, that's the same army that when they tried crossing the Red Sea, because God opened it up for the Israelites to go through, and they walked on dry ground. But when Pharaoh's army tried the same thing, what happened? Those walls of water came and encompassed them and drowned them. God's hand was on it. God said, calm down, I'll take care of it. And then, sure enough, He did take care of it. And when it was all done and the Israelites were on the other side, they gave God a word, a name that, as I have been reading this now for a while, this name I think is one of my favorites for who God is. And they called him Ish Milchama, which means man of war. In Exodus 15:3, they called him the man of war. That's awesome, because God fought for them. God told them to calm down, and then God fought for them. And He brought them from one side where they were still being chased and tormented with their fears, and He brought them to the other side where they found the next steps, the next piece of direction in this path that they were supposed to take to the Promised Land. But before the Torah portion finishes out, we see one more aspect of God, one more name that He's called. They called Him Jehovah Nissi, or Adonai Nissi, God my banner. And why would they call him that? What situation were they going through? Well, if you read on, they were engaged in a battle with the Amalekites. And the Amalekites, you know, they found that, well, they were a little bit more powerful. They were more advanced in war. I mean, we have the Israelites. They came from the background of being slaves. And you have the Amalekites who are trained in war and they're ready to go. But again, we got God on our side, on the Israelites here. And so what happens? God says, Moses, as long as you raise your hands up, you will find victory. But if your arms start to slump down, that's when you're going to start losing. And so Joshua took the troops out, and they were out there and they were fighting. And here's Moses with his hands being raised. And when his hands got tired, what happened? He had Aaron on one side and Hur on the other side, and they held his hands up for him. It's a great illustration of accountability, but it's also a great illustration that God, again, is a man of war, and he keeps his promises. And he told them to calm down back before they crossed the sea, and that same aspect applied later on, as here they were fighting against the Amalekites. I want to close this portion just by encouraging you. Follow the direction of God. And it might not be as easy to see for us as it was for them back then. But follow God's direction. When you feel that prompting, when you hear his voice, follow what he says, because that is going to pay off. It's going to be the obedience that leads us into the next step. But also know that God is a man of war, and he will fight for you. You dedicate yourself to him, and he will dedicate himself to you. He will become our banner. He will become our man of war. He will become the one that protects us and that brings us from one spot to another. I hope you're encouraged by these words today. Shalom.